Hello and welcome to New Humanum. We're working in Westminster today on the margins of NatCon 23, that's National Conservative Conference, the first that's ever been held in the UK. It's a political conference, of course, but a surprising number of people at it are people of faith. Among them, Sebastian Morello, a philosopher, writer and journalist. When I sat down with Sebastian earlier, I asked him first about his early life and formation. Sebastian, welcome to New Humanum.
Thank you for having me.
As a start, perhaps we could talk about you as a young man. I mean, you're a philosopher now. Was that always something on the horizon, an interest of yours?
Well, I mean, as you know, a typical British education doesn't really allow for many philosophical inquiries. So, you know, I was sent to a typical boarding school as a child, and a bit of history, a bit of religious education, but heavy on the sciences and mathematics and so on. So that you know, the old English education of providing a humane induction into our civilizational roots, I'm afraid, was certainly gone by the time I was at school.
Where was that school?
Shipley College on Henley-on-Thames. Yeah.
And the family, did you come from a religious family? Was there a religious background in the family?
Well, my father has certainly a very philosophical mind, and he has always been a practicing Anglican, but was always interested in questions of comparative religion, and was very keen on studying Hinduism and Buddhism as well. And so I always found that very interesting. My mother, less so, although she has become, I think, more engaged in the life of the parish more recently. I was sent to typical Anglican boarding schools, so, you know, chapel every day, twice on Sundays. And then I ended up leaving early, 16, went off to an arts college and did a diploma in the theatrical arts. And that, I think, was very important because I discovered this incredible world of storytelling and, well, truly humane education. You know, reading Shakespeare was an incredibly important time in my life, and I realised there was a different education. There was a different kind of education out there, which was an education that was concerned with questions of meaning, questions of beauty, what it means to live a purposeful and I suppose really, and maybe we can explore what's meant by this, but an aesthetic life. Now, I don't mean the life of an aesthete in the Victorian sense, but really a life that takes the beautifying of one's activities, one's relations with others very seriously, as if this isn't just an add-on or an extra, but really touches the essence of what it is to live a dignified human existence. And the arts, particularly the theatrical arts, was my avenue into that humane education. So I'm very grateful for that.
And of course, aesthetics are very important in religious worship as well. Was it? So you came from a family background which was Anglican, but when did you really engage with the faith? I mean, you're now a Catholic, aren't you?
I am. So yeah.
What was that journey? Explain.
Yeah. So I was always interested, as many people are, in the Eastern religions, and I suppose I got that partly from my father. Towards the end of my own theatrical arts education, I was visiting a lot of Buddhist monasteries, trying out various meditative practices, and my father said to me, this is all very well, but you really need to familiarise yourself with your own religious tradition. I said, well, I know, as I said, I went to chapel every day. I know about all that.
I know it.
Exactly. And he said, well, why don't you read John's Gospel from beginning to end? And I took that as a bit of a challenge. And so I did. And, there are probably 10 books that I would be prepared to call life-changing. And I'd definitely put John's Gospel as number one. It was really a totally transformative moment. And I started going back to church.
But why? Why was reading John's Gospel so transformative?
Well, I suppose because look, I mean, this is a very difficult question to answer. The entire modern moral paradigm is one of creating or authoring ex nihilo your own sense of meaning and purpose. And actually, what is increasingly happening is that people are realizing that attempting to do that lands you in nihilism. Reading John's Gospel was a lesson to me that meaning didn't need to be conjured up out of a vacuum, but rather it could be bestowed upon your life. If only you, if you'll allow me to sort of descend into poetic language for a moment, if only you open your heart, then actually your life can be flooded with meaning and purpose. This was a total affront to the entire understanding of a meaning-driven life that I had been given by a mainstream modern Western culture and Western education. So that set me on a path from which I haven't really ever come off.
So that simple exercise of reading that gospel led you back into a more active church life and an engagement with established Christianity. But But the road to Rome, how did that?
Well, so I started going back to church, the local parish church, and then the local vicar, who was a lady, very nice lady, said, have you thought maybe you have a vocation to become a clergyman? I had just been accepted into quite a prestigious theatrical arts college, art school, and by that point I had become so interested in pursuing I suppose I had realised by that point that the arts had been a pathway into a different understanding of what civilization is, of what meaning is, of what a beautiful human life is. But actually it wasn't that to which I could devote my life. It had just been a conduit. And so I became rather keen on this thought of becoming a clergyman. It was around that time that I had a very strange, I'm happy to, I'm not embarrassed to call it a sort of mystical experience, which the content of which I won't bore you with, but I became quite interested in pursuing that, and so I thought a lot about the institution to which I would be giving my life were I to become an Anglican clergyman, and I became increasingly unconvinced by the credibility of the Anglican Church and the story it tells about itself. Now, this is a complex thing, because even to this day I remain very grateful to my experience of the Anglican Church, to the prayer book, and later, many years after I had been received into the Catholic Church, I joined the Ordinariate just to honour that, that formation that I had received. But because I had become... I mean, there were certain things that worried me. Do you want me to go into them?
I do. Well, I'm very interested because I'm thinking of other famous Anglicans who have moved across to Catholicism. The one who comes to mind, obviously, is John Henry Newman. And he, in his writings, you can see that doubts arose in his mind about the authenticity or perhaps the and this is a technical thing, but the apostolic succession, for instance, and what happened at the Reformation and the authenticity of Anglican orders and all that. I mean, was that part of your uncertainties too?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps in a less scholarly way. Interesting enough, we had this lovely lady, a vicar who ran the local church, but I became quite concerned by this this notion that Jesus Christ had male and female disciples, but had only apparently ordained his male disciples.
Yes.
And the more I thought about that, the more I thought, well, either there is something about sexual complementarity and something about the mystery of the incarnation, that the incarnation is itself sexed, right? There's something about this that matters. Or Jesus Christ was bigoted and just did not see the inherent leadership worth of women, which I think would undermine other claims we want to make about him. Or he wasn't so much bigoted, but he was aware of the bigotry of the time, and he was perhaps cowardly and capitulated on that.
He was acculturated.
Right, yeah.
Which doesn't sit easily with the idea of the Son of God.
Or that he willingly went to his own torture and crucifixion, which is not, typical of a coward to behave in that way. So there are all sorts of reasons why I thought, the notion that he ordained only his male disciples because of an understanding of sexual complementarity, and also that the universe itself is gendered. The English language doesn't pick up on that in the way that Romance languages do, but this is a cosmic mystery as well, and that the source of both the Son and the Holy Ghost in the life of the Trinity is also gendered. That actually it's simply not part of Christian prayer to pray to our Mother, unless perhaps we're talking about the one from whom Jesus Christ drew his human nature, namely Mary.
Yes.
So I thought, well, actually, there's something going wrong here, and it's not the case cannot be one of sexual discrimination. It has to be framed in theological terms about the purpose and mission of the incarnate Lord. Let's put it like that. So that was one issue, and then there were other issues. There were issues about the relation between scripture and tradition and all sorts of things. The more I started thinking about these, the more I became unconvinced by the claims of the Anglican Church, and so that sort of set me off on exploring. At first, I explored a lot Eastern Orthodoxy and then Roman Catholicism.
Was it wounding for people close to you that you decided to become a Catholic? I mean, did it cause? Was it a difficult thing for you to do?
Yeah, I mean, I lost some friends over it, and I know it really disturbed my close family. I mean, my great-grandfather was a Catholic priest, who a Polish Catholic priest, who left the church, became a Lutheran pastor, and really devoted the rest of his life to writing anti-Catholic tracts, all of which I've read, and they do make for a jolly good read. But I've come to disagree with him. So there was a long history of anti-Catholicism in my family, and so, interestingly enough, over the years, my family have become very sympathetic to my choice, largely because they've seen the wokeification of the Anglican Church. Under Rowan Williams, even though he's said some very troubling things recently, under Rowan Williams, the Anglican Church still felt like a serious intellectual enterprise in this country. Under Welby and Cottrell, who, well, I don't want to be mean, but they don't. These are not wellsprings of profound thinking.
Why do you? What's gone wrong in Anglicanism? Do you think? I'm interested because I heard someone in advance of the coronation say that the wonderful thing about Anglicanism is it's like an umbrella for all the religions in the country. It's the established religion, and in its shadow, all other religions and all other faiths can prosper. Do you think there's something in that, or?
Well, maybe. It's had to be like that.
Yes.
Simply because the country has become very religiously diverse in a very short period of time. But it's very strange to say that is the nature of Anglicanism per se, because we know that in the past Anglicanism was a highly aggressive and coercive institution. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. The country had gone through a whole set of complicated relationships with the Pope and more broadly the Catholic Church because of the kings of France and so on. But also there was a very aggressive dissenter and Puritan tradition in this country, which was successful in winning a war and committing regicide and, founding...
We tend to forget all this.
Yeah, exactly. Founding one of the first kind of absolute dictatorships in the world.
Yes.
So, this was not just a small problem that the country was dealing with. And so, after a series of ruptures, one of the ways that the established church protected itself was by, fining those who didn't go to communion, and by barring dissenters and Catholics from the top universities in the country. It wasn't until the 1880s,
yes.
That's
right.
Durham, Oxford, Cambridge.
Yes. An amazing thought, and one which is almost unknown to the population.
Well, that's right. So this kind of big, broad Disneyland conception of Anglicanism is not a description of its approach to religion down the ages.
Do you think they've been driven into that corner because, or do you think that is a sort of, that is a strategy, if you will, to provide them with a continuing purpose?
Well, I don't know, but if that's the case, it's definitely not working. Because one thing we do know is that the Catholic Church and the evangelical churches are growing in this country. Now, the Catholic churches and the evangelical churches are broadly united on a whole load of moral questions, and there is clearly increasing appetite for coherent, clear answers to these moral questions. So, it seems to me that if the Anglican Church does want to protect its future, it's going to have to be a little bit more robust in its defence of the religion it claims to profess.
Now, we're talking, you and I, in the margins of this conference being held, NatCon 23, National Conservatism 23. And do you consider yourself to be a conservative? And if so, what is the nature of that conservatism? Are you a conservative because you are a believer and a Catholic, or is it the other way around?
It's a very interesting question. Well, firstly, I would say I am a conservative, a small c conservative, as they say. I'm routinely extremely disappointed by the Conservative Party.
Aren't we all?
Yeah. Now, it's an interesting question. I would not call myself a conservative in the sense that a lot of people, would mean by that if they were to use that term for themselves. I came to conservatism largely by trying to understand what had happened in the 18th century. I mean, basically, I became interested in rationalism. It all began with an epistemological question for me. What is it about the modern mind that privileges abstractions over concrete things? This was the big question for me.
Illustrate that. Give me an illustration of what you mean by that. In what way does the modern mind prioritise the concrete over the... Explain.
Well, why is it that we think that arguments are more robust when we talk about humanity and when we talk about the English? Or why is it that we think arguments are more robust if we talk about, say, rights than how you treat your family members, right? The kind of duties that you didn't choose, you just found yourself with by virtue of the milieu in which you were born. What is, because it's not clear at all that pre-modern people privileged or prioritised abstract, unanchored, disembodied concepts as if they were more real than the actual concrete things with which we're surrounded.
Interesting.
And this has troubled me for a long time, and it is a huge assault on the mystery of the incarnation, which is why I can't really... It would be interesting to try to see which way round it is, whether because of various prior religious commitments I was pushed to think about this question, or whether, having asked myself this question, I then went back and made more sense of my religious commitment. I don't really know which way around it is. I expect these had a symbiotic relationship, really. But just to finish on this point, if you are looking for where this strange privileging of abstract thinking came from, you see it emerging in the scientific revolution. You see it with particularly people like Francis Bacon. But it really explodes into the moral and political sphere in the 18th century, particularly with the French Revolution. It's these assumptions about the human mind, about the moral life, about how we relate to each other, about what a polity is. These assumptions are popularised. They're brought out of the salons by Rousseau, really, with Emile and the social contract. And the more I looked at this stuff, I thought they're all wrong. I mean, they're wrong about all of this. This is all incorrect, and we're all children of these people in the way that we think. So then I became interested in, well, who said they were wrong at the time? And of course, then I started reading Burke and Maistre and Bonnard and Chateaubriand and Cortez and all of these great, really aggressive conservative thinkers. And, as expected, I thought, well, these were the guys who were right. No one listened to them, and we're still not listening to them, but they were right. Now, it's not obvious to me that were you to go into that conference, were you to start talking about conservatism, they would have the kind of arguments in their minds that I have as a consequence of having read these people for so many years. But I can't think of another name for myself. Maybe traditionalist or reactionary. I don't know. But I'm happy with the word conservative. It's the word that Roger Scruton used, and he taught me, and, you know.
I was just going to come on to that, because I mentioned in my introduction that you were someone who was much influenced and greatly admired Roger Scruton. Of course, he's revered now as the great conservative thinker of our era, although he's sadly dead. Tell me what impact he had on you, actually. I mean, what was it about him and his thought processes and his writings which hit home?
Well, I did a BA in philosophy when I was working, so I did it part-time through the Open University. And it was
That's the hard way to do it, of course.
Well, yeah, although it enables you to kind of bypass all the campus nonsense that's going around at the moment. And I never thought I would finish it. You know, I had a girlfriend at the time who said, "Look, you're always reading books on philosophy and asking philosophical questions. Why don't you get a qualification in it?" And I thought, "Oh, okay, fine." And I finished it. I did very well. And during that time, I had been looking for philosophers, not only philosophers with whom I could contend, but also philosophers whose arguments I could utilise to advance my own views on the world. And, you know, in this sense, I suppose I'm quite postmodern in that, at least in this one aspect, that I do think that philosophy isn't just about pursuing the truth, but also about giving intellectual weight to your prejudices. You know, that I have a lot of prejudices that I think are very wholesome, prejudices in favour of the family, in favour of marriage, in favour of locality. And it would be very difficult for me right from scratch to argue for all of these things. A lot of them just come out of my experience of loving my family and loving, you know, the county in which I grew up and all of that stuff. So then I started looking around for people who had those arguments and I could utilise them. And of course Roger was such an obvious person. And then I was fortunate enough to start working with him through an initiative to encourage the study of the liberal arts in London called the Benedictus Institute. And he was you know, endorsing that project and coming and giving talks, so we got to know each other. I was then invited to do a master's under him at Buckingham. And so I did a master's on the Platonic or Neoplatonic themes in the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas, and Roger was horrified by that because he thought that was all you know, pre-Kantian dinosaur stuff. But I explored the relevance of these Neoplatonic themes in the realism of Aquinas to the field of aesthetics, and there Roger and I had some really fruitful conversations.
He was he had this notion, didn't he, of the importance of beauty.
Yeah.
And there was that horrid episode when he was drummed out of that unpaid post that he had, which was to do, I think, with trying to beautify the
building better. Yeah,
yes. Yeah. And his aesthetic, his appreciation of these matters went very deep, didn't it?
Oh yeah, oh absolutely, and he embodied all of that. You know, the way he would, I would go and have conversations with him at Albany, sometimes at his farm in Gloucestershire, and we would, you know, just the way he arranged the room, the way that he was very sensitive to this was a space in which you felt fully human. Mm-hmm. And also, it's quite interesting. I mean, Burke has this whole theory, and that it plays an important subterranean role in his abridgment of English history, which is a work that no one ever reads, but is very important, about the relationship between aesthetics and manners. the way that you treat other people, the way that you present yourself to others. And you got this with Roger all the time. He was so sensitive to the dispositions of other people. Sometimes, particularly in the year when we were doing our masters, people would ask very silly questions sometimes, and you could see he would never let the person feel silly. He would always say, well, I think there's an important point there which we should tease out together, and he would always affirm the person.
I could speak to personal experience with this because I interviewed Roger Scruton a couple of times as a journalist, and I'm sure I'm one of those people who ask stupid questions of him. But he was, whereas I can think of other people, great intellects, for instance, Enoch Powell comes to mind. He was somebody who made you feel small, actually. He used his great intellect to bully you. Roger Scruton, on the other hand, was a gentleman, a gentle man, wasn't he?
Well, you know the story that Roger, when he first got really into fox hunting, but he didn't have the outfit, for it. And he was at a dinner with Enoch Powell, and he mentioned fox hunting. And of course, late in life, Powell had become a great hunting enthusiast, but had given it up because it's too dangerous at that age. And he looked at Roger and he said, well, you are about my stature, in physique, of course, not in intellect. And he sold his livery to Roger. So
I don't think the historical record will necessarily bear that
out. No, indeed, quite right. Yeah.
Did you? So you were at the feet of this modern master. How fascinating that was, and how fruitful for you.
Yeah.
And you're now. I mean, I introduced you as a philosopher, and you've written extensively on philosophy, but you're also involved in this publishing venture, the European Conservative. Tell me about the European Conservative. What is the aim of the magazine?
We do a lot of day-to-day reporting on our website, but that's not the main purpose of the European Conservative. The main purpose is to address the civilizational questions. What are our sources? Who are we as a European people? And really, I think, broadly speaking, we see there to be four sources, or it's better really to say three sources and then another. I'll explain what I mean. Those three sources would probably be the Greek Hellenic wisdom tradition, the Roman imperial and legal tradition, and the low cultural national, if you like, folk tradition. And then the fourth of those sources would be how all three of those were assumed into the message of the gospel. And if you want to look for what is Europe, because it's not that obvious, what connects Estonia to, I don't know, Valladolid, or, it's not that obvious how these people relate to one another, but in a way that India and China and, I don't know, Mozambique or whatever, in a way that these countries can't, these countries can claim those civilizational sources in a very direct way. Perhaps other countries can through colonial history, all sorts of things, but these four sources really explain the nations of Europe. At the European Conservative, we think that Europe is under the spell of a kind of weird amnesia about this. We don't understand these sources. We're not sensitive to them. We can't trace them in our architectural tradition, our aesthetics, in the way that we debate, the way we think about things. We can't see their traces in our political processes, in our great institutions. One of the great boasts of this country is its common law tradition. This is a tradition that's rapidly vanishing through a weird introduce continental-style statute-based legal system, and the introduction of activist law and all of this sort of thing. You know, we're under the spell of, as I say, a weird amnesia, and now we're just drifting.
How would you compare the debate on these matters in other European countries compared with, say, Britain? I mean, this conference here today is a new venture, first time it's been held. It has brought together different strands of conservatism. As you say, conservatism is an elastic term, and it is a big tent, as the Home Secretary said today. But how does the debate here compare with elsewhere in Europe about this question of European identity and who we really are? Is it an active debate, would you say?
Well, I mean, certainly in some countries, in Poland, Hungary are the obvious countries where people are becoming very conscious that actually, after decades of communism and then, you know, I mean, Roger, at the end of his book, Notes from Underground, says, you know, the slaves were finally released and then they all became idiots, right? and of course what he means by that is the moment these countries were emancipated from the Soviet bloc, all of the materialism and nihilism of a late liberal modern West flooded in, you know, to use a Marxist term, commodifying everything, and so suddenly, having just reclaimed their national identity, that sort of evaporated in this weird, malignant, universal pop culture, you know, and they're realising this, and
but there is a pushback, isn't there? I mean, and
now there is.
Yes, in Hungary particularly. I mean,
yeah.
You know, you go to Budapest and there are Roger Scruton cafes.
Yeah,
which is,
well, he's a hero over there.
Yes. Yeah, but so you must take heart from that, of course.
Well, I do. They are punished for it, though,
yes.
by their friends in Brussels, and,
yes.
and so it's not easy what they're doing.
Do you? I mean, are you essentially an optimist about these matters and about the society we live in? I mean, do you feel that? I mean, from my own point of view, I'm a much older man than you. I think that what is encouraging is that for the first time really in my lifetime these matters are being debated in a quite explicit way. So to me this seems an optimistic sign.
Well, okay, it's certainly true that having for many decades we have only had a public conversation about questions of productivity, efficiency, individual rights, you know, if you like, largely what people are calling a sort of value-free, values-free public discourse. That has led to widespread alienation, disenchantment, and sort of malaise, really. You know, this has been very unhealthy. It's deeply nihilistic. Questions of who we are as a people and what are our sources of meaning and purpose and how we're bound together as a meaning-driven community. These are coming back, or they're coming to the fore again. So this is what people are describing as the return of a values-based public discourse. This is very good in one sense, okay, for all the reasons, you know, you think are encouraging. It also means that politics is about to get way more divisive than it's been in the past. The recently ousted Fox News commentator Tucker Carlson gave a speech recently at the Heritage Foundation for their 50th anniversary, in which he essentially said, we have to get used to the fact that we are entering a political discourse that sees things that frames the discussion as one between good and evil. Mm-hmm. And that, for a long time, conservatives have been used to saying things like, well, let's have a conversation, whilst liberals and progressives have been saying, well, no, because we're the good guys and you're evil and we can't have a conversation with you. And Tucker Carlson was essentially saying, if I'm trying to sum up his point, well, there are things that progressives are demanding that conservatives think are evil, and maybe conservatives need to start getting used to saying, well, we think we're good and that you're evil. Well, if that's going to be the political discourse of the future, it's definitely a values-based discourse, but it's going to be a very aggressive, very divisive, very violent one. And it's not obvious that our, inherited democratic political processes, our parliamentary democracy, is going to easily accommodate that kind of a discourse. I mean, the last time we, in this country, had a public discourse that even touched upon that kind of content was probably the one between Gladstone and Disraeli, where Disraeli was really attempting to give a coherent vision for what Toryism is all about, and he was arguing that this was a one nation movement that was actually wanted to unite the landed families with the working population against this kind of middle class liberal oligarchical elite, as we would say today. And he was arguing, Gladstone's party serves those people, and that's not what Toryism is going to support. That's quite close to a good versus evil political discourse. But, famously, that was a hugely divisive time in English history.
But shouldn't we, and I speak now as a fellow Catholic, actually, but we shouldn't shy away from this, should we? Because if this, there is a purpose to having a debate where people speak plainly, even if that offends the ears of the opposition. This is something which we are enjoined to do, is it not?
Well, I think so. I'm not saying that. I mean, look...
You're just saying we should brace ourselves.
I think we have to brace ourselves, yes. I mean, English conservatism, at least in its modern idiom, you might say, largely begins with Burke. I mean, Burke was in the habit of calling his adversaries evil, and that's how he framed the debate. And Reflections on the Revolution in France is shot through with that kind of terminology. And perhaps that is the idiom in which conservatism should be at home. But, this is not a political discourse to which we're used.
No.
I do welcome it in as far as I'm deeply anxious about the future of the nation, about the future of marriage, about the future of family, about the kind of what I see to be highly malignant moral, ethical worldview into which our children are being inducted, unbeknownst to most parents.
Yes.
And if you can't have that debate taking seriously the moral terms that are required in order to express the kind of concerns that are relevant here, then you can't have the debate. But my point is, it's going to get nasty.
Yes.
And you already see it in campus polemics.
Yes. You're a family man yourself. You're married. You have children.
3, yeah.
3 children, and so these matters, of course, are of pressing concern to any parent. I mean, something which is often concerns me is the, for instance, just to take an example, the way that the culture now is saturated in pornography. This is something which we apparently are supposed to acknowledge now as just being part of the landscape, and, well, that's it, as if we could do nothing about it. Now, surely that is the sort of area, isn't it, where social conservatives, if we can use that term, which might embrace the two of us, for instance, that's an area where campaigning and debating and trying to change things would be well worthwhile.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting to see this coalition between strands of feminism and conservative movements. You know, we've had two speakers today here at this conference.
Wasn't that interesting? Louise Perry, I thought, was very interesting.
Very interesting, and you know, I've interviewed Mary Harrington for the European Conservative, and we've had some fascinating exchanges. And I've recently read her new book, which is excellent. But you know, these are two feminist writers who are presenting a very robust case against pornography. I mean, the question is, could we go the whole hog and bring back some of the old conservative, here's a very controversial word, paternalistic measures, in which we're actually saying, you know, look, the state itself has an obligation to protect the citizenry from sources that are going to corrupt them morally, that's going to undermine them as flourishing human beings. I mean, now, even at the level of the kind of neuroscientific data, even before you go into what this does to how we relate to one another, even before you go into moral questions, just at the level of the neuroscientific data, you know, we're now seeing that those who are addicted to the use of pornography develop this hypofrontal condition where actually you have a decreased blood flow to the frontal lobes, which are connected with executive function and all sorts of things. And so, and the large frontal lobes that we have are really unique to the species we are. So even at a sort of total materialistic level, we're actually seeing through pornography human beings becoming less human through their pornography use. Then when you introduce moral considerations of how we relate to each other, how we see each other, it's very difficult, I think, to offer a really, really robust moral case for pornography. So the way that we're doing it at the moment is we're just not having the conversation.
No, indeed.
Yeah.
And isn't it time that we did have that debate? And I mean, these are things that so for most of my lifetime, political debate in this country, abortion is another issue actually, where exactly the same thing has happened. We no longer have that debate because, actually, partly because most of the mainstream media is firmly in the hands of social liberals who are all in favour of these things. Yeah. And so you can't have that debate because the public square is closed to you. That's part of the problem, isn't it? But we need to have these debates, and we need to have politicians, don't we, who will first of all enunciate these things and try to legislate on them. And there's been a woeful lack of that in the so-called Conservative Party, I would think.
Oh yeah, well, not just that. I mean, the Conservative Party are still promulgating these things. I mean, you know, during the COVID episode, the Conservative Party was, you know, encouraging women to have abortions at home and all sorts of things. I mean, through active legislation, doing this. So, I mean, look, you're not going to get a defence of the Conservative Party on any of these issues from me. So,
no, nor me.
No.
So to wind up then, Sebastian. I mean, so this is we have been talking in quite theoretical and you have been talking in very learned, elevated terms about these matters, which is of course what philosophers do. But you live your life as a Catholic layman. What does the faith mean to you day to day, as it were? How does it impact on your your sort of real life as the individual Sebastian Morello?
Gosh. Well, look, I pray each morning, I pray before meals, I pray the rosary with my family every day. We have our prayers. I try to do some spiritual reading each day. But I'm slightly cautious, actually, of the inclination to see the spiritual life or life of prayer as something that happens at particular events in the day, rather than something that's contiguous with the whole life of the baptized. I mean, this comes back to the 18th century point, in the Baconian point. I think that we have to recover a Christianized Neoplatonic view that the whole world is an emanation of the Godhead, and he is disclosing himself through history. And yes, it's also wounded and sinful and fragmented, but much like a scratched icon might be, it really is nonetheless a communication of him. And that's not a pantheistic view, just as my speech is not me, but it does truly convey me and what I want to say. And this I think is we have to see our experience, our immersion in this remarkable world that we're doing a lot of damage to. We have to see ourselves as really really facing the communication of the Godhead, and so every moment of the day is an invitation to glorify him and to be in union with him. And that's why, I'm slightly nervous about saying this because it's often misunderstood, but I think that Christians have to recapture a sense that their lives are mystical lives. Their lives are lives in which they are, every moment of the day is a new moment of immersing oneself in the relationship that the incarnation has made possible. And so, yes, it's important to understand the laws of the church, to go to the sacraments that are the means of our holiness, to understand one's obligations as a Christian and so on. But all of those things are means to... So, you ask the question, what does it mean on a day-to-day basis? Well, I have this experience all the time, being with my children, going out walking the dog in the countryside, or whatever it is, habituating the awareness that one is in the bosom of the Father all the time. I think that is that must be ordinary to the Christian, and that is what the filial relationship that baptism invites us to is all about, I think. I'm surprised that this isn't something that's talked about much more among Christians, but I really think that is at the heart of what the Christian life is.
Do you think Roger Scruton had any notion of this?
Well, yes, I think he absolutely did, and I often think in the book I and Thou by Martin Buber, there's a wonderful passage in which Buber says that there is the man who thinks that he is truly religious because he asks God for the things that he needs. And then there is the man who thinks he is an atheist, but he looks out of his window at night and he looks into the void and he speaks. And I think this is very important. You know, if one sees God not as a person, but as an object of utility, then you have reduced God to a sort of divine vending machine, you know. And I'm not, that's not to say that we shouldn't beg for the things that we need, but actually what is primary is the relationship to which God invites us. And I think Roger's spirituality was exactly like this. You know, it was always tentative, it was always skeptical, but he would say, you know, prayer is the most natural thing. He often used to say this, prayer is the most natural thing, because he would look out into the void and he would always speak. And when anyone met Roger, everyone came away with this sense that they had met someone who had habituated this in his life.
And of course, he also spent quite a long time in church playing the organ, didn't he? So, Sebastian Morello, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, and fascinating actually, so thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. If you've enjoyed watching this interview, and I hope you have, and you'd like to see more of this kind of work, you might care to consider making a small donation. If you go to our website, newhumanum.org, and follow the links, you'll find a donation page. Anything you can give us would be gratefully received.